Good morning, crime community. I'm here to read out about Percy Bysshe Shelley and his wife, Mary Shelley. This will be the last time I read about them. This is the end of the book. Notes on Poems of 1822 by Mrs. Mary Shelley. This was the last year of the life of Shelley's. These notes end. They are not what I intended them to be. I began with energy and a burning desire to impart to the world, in worthy language, the sense I have of the virtues and genius of the beloved and the lost. My strength has failed under the task. Reoccurrence to the past, full of its own deep and unforgotten joys and sorrows, contrasting with succeeding years of painful and solitary struggle, has shaken my health. Days of great suffering have followed my attempts to write, and these again produced a weakness and languor that spread their sinister influences over these notes. I dislike spreading of myself, but cannot help apologizing to the dead and to the public for not having executed in the manner I desire the history I engaged to give of Shelley's writings. I at one time feared that the correction of the press might be less exact through my illness, but I believe that it is nearly free from error. From hysterics occur on a few pages, and they did in the volume of posthumous poems, either because they refer to private concerns or because the original manuscript was left imperfect. Did anyone see the papers from which I drew that volume? The wonder which be how any eyes or patience were capable of extracting it from so confused a mass, interlined with the broken into fragments, so that the sense could only be deciphered and joined by guesses which might seem rather intuitive than founding on reason. Yet I believe no mistake was made. The winter of 1822 was passed in Pisa, if we might call that season winter, in which the autumn merged into spring after the interval of but few days of bleaker weather. Spring sprang up early and with extreme beauty. Shelley was conceived the idea of writing a tragedy on the subject of Charles I. It was one that he believed adapted for the drama, full of intense interest, contrasted character, and busy passion. He had recommended it long before when he encouraged me to attempt the play. Whether the subject moved more difficult than he anticipated, or whether the fact that he could not bend his mind away from the brooding and wanderings of thought, divested from human interests, which he best loved, I cannot tell, but he proceeded slowly and threw it aside from one of the most mystical of his poems, The Triumph of Life, on which he was employed at the last. His passion for boating was fostered at this time, and having among our friends several sailors, his favorite companion, Edward Elliker Williams, and the 8th Light Dragoons, has begun his life in the Navy and had afterwards entered the army. He had spent several years in India, and his love for adventure and many exercises accorded with Shelley's taste. It was their favorite plan to build a boat such as they could manage themselves, and in living in the seacoast to enjoy at every hour and season the pleasure they loved best. Captain Roberts, R.N., undertook to build the boat of Genoa, where he was occupied to build the Bolivar for Lord Byron. Ours was to be an open boat on the model taken from one of the royal dockyards. I have since heard one of these was a defect in this model, and that it was never seaworthy. In the month of February, Shelley and his friend went to Pisa to seek the houses for us. Only one was to be found at all suitable. However, a trifle such as not finding a house could not stop Shelley. The one found was to serve for all. It was unfurnished. We sent our furniture by sea, and with a good deal of precipitation arising from his impatience, made our removal. We left Pisa on the April of 26. The Bay of Pisa is one of the considerable extent and divided by a rocky promontory into a larger and smaller one. The town of Larissa is situated on the eastern point and in the depth of the smaller bay, which bears the name of this town, in the village of San Terenzo. Our house, Casa Magni, was close to this village. The sea came up to the door. A steep hill sheltered it behind. The proprietor of the estate on which it was situated was insane. He had begun to erect a large house in the summit of the hill behind, and his malady prevented it being furnished, and it was falling into ruin. He had, and this to the Italians that seemed a glaring symptom of very decided madness, rooted up the olives in the hillside and planted forest trees. They were the most young, but the plantation was more in English taste than I ever elsewhere saw in Italy, and from fine walnut and ilex trees and intermingled their dark, massy foliage and formed grooves from which haunt by memory, and then they satiated the eye with a sense of loveliness. The scene was indeed an unimaginable beauty. The blue extent of waters, an almost landlocked bay, the near castle of the Cerci, shutting it into the east, and distant Porto Venere to the west, and varied forms of precipitous rocks that bound into the beach, over which there was only a winding, rugged footpath towards the Cerci, and none on the either side. The tideless sea, leaving no sands nor shingle, formed a picture which is one sees in Salvador Rosa's landscapes only. Sometimes the sunshine vanished when the Sirocco raged. The Ponente, the wind was called on that shore. The gales and squalls that hailed the first arrival sounded the bay with foam. The howling wind swept round our exposed house, and the sea roared unremittedly, so we almost fancied ourselves on board ship. At other times, sunshine and common vested sea and sky, and the rich tints of Italian heaven bathed the scene in bright and ever varying tints. The natives were wilder in that place. Our near neighbors in Tan Terenzo were more like savages than any people I have ever lived among. Many a night they passed on the beach singing or rather howling, the women dancing about among the waves that broke at their feet, the men leaning against the rocks and joining in their loud, wild chorus. We get no more provisions near than Saranza at the distance of 3.5 miles off the torrents of Magra between, and even there was the supply was very different. It had been wrecked on the island of the South Seas. We could scarcely have felt ourselves farther from civilization and comfort, but there was the sunshines, and latter became an unnecessary luxury, and we had enough society among ourselves. Yet I confess housekeeping became rather a toilsome task, especially as I was suffering in my health and could not exert myself actively. At first, the fatal boat had not arrived and was expected with great impatience. On Monday, May 12th, it came. Williams records a long wished for fact in his journal, cloudy and threatened weather, and Magellan called, and after dinner and while walking with him on the terrace, he discovered a strange sail coming round the point on Porto Venere, which proved at length to be Shelley's boat. He had left Genoa on Thursday last, but had been driven back by the prevailing bad winds. Mr. Helslop and 2 English seamen brought her round, and they speak most highly of her performances. She does indeed excite my surprise and admiration. Shelley and I walked to Le Cerci and made a stretch off the land to try her, and I find she fetches whatever she looks at. In short, we have now a perfect plane for the summer. It was thus the short-sighted mortals welcomed death, and having distinguished this grim form in the bleaking mask, the time for the friends was now spent on the sea. The weather became fine, and our whole party often passes the evening on the water, when the wild promised pleasant sailing. Shelley and Williams made no longer excursions. They sailed several miles to Massa. They had engaged in one of the seamen who brought her round, a boy by name Charles Vivian, and they had not the slightest apprehension of danger. When the weather wasn't favorable, they employed themselves with alterations in the rigging, and they built a boat of canvas and reeds, as light as possible, to have on board with other for the convenience of landing in waters too shallow for the larger vessel. When Shelley was on board, he had his papers with him, and much of the triumph of life was written as he sailed or weltered on that sea that was soon to engulf him. The heat set in the middle of June. The days became excessively hot. By the sea breeze cooled the air at noon, and extreme heat always put Shelley in spirits. A long drought was preceded the heat, and prayers for rain and being put up in the churches, and processions of relics for the same effect took place in every town. At this time we received letters announcing the arrival of Leigh Hunt of Genoa. Shelley was very eager to see him. I was confined in my room by severe illness and could not move. It was agreed that Shelley and Williams would go to Leghorn in the boat. Strange that a fear of danger crossed our minds. Living in a seashore, the ocean came as a plaything, as a child may sport with a lighted stick. Still a spark inflames a forest and spreads destruction over all. So we did. We fearlessly and blindly tampered with danger and make a game of the terrors of the ocean. Our Italian neighbors even trusted themselves as far as Massa in the skiff, and running down the line of coast to Leghorn gave no more notion of peril than a fair-weathered inland navigation would have done to those who had never seen the sea. Once, some months before, Trelawney had raised a warning voice as to the difference of our calm bay and open sea beyond, but Shelley and his friends, with their one sailor boy, thought themselves a match for the storms of the Mediterranean in a boat which they looked upon as equal to all it was put to do. On the 1st of July, they left us. If every shadow of future ill darkened the present hour, such as over my mind when they went, during the whole of our stay at Laerci, the intense presentiment of coming evil brooded over my mind, and covering this beautiful place in genial summer with the shadows of coming misery. I had vainly struggled with these emotions. They seemed accounted by for my illness, and as this hour of separation they recurred with renewed violence. I did not anticipate danger for them, but a vague exception of evil shook me to agony, and I could scarcely bring myself to let them go. The day was calm and clear, and a fine breeze rising at 12, they weighed for Leghorn. They made the run of about 50 miles in 7 hours and a half. The Bolivar was in port, and the regulations of the health office permitted them to go on shore after sunset. They borrowed cushions from the larger vessel and slept on board their boat. They spent a week at Pisa and Leghorn. They want to rain was severely felt in the country. The weather continued sultry and fine. I heard that Shelley at all this time was in brilliant spirits. Not long before, talking of present, he had said the only one he had ever found infallible was a certain advent of some evil fortune, when he felt peculiarly joyous. Yet if ever fate whispered of coming disaster, such an audible but not unfelt protagonist hovered around us. The beauty of the place seemed unearthly in its excess. The distance was we were from all signs of civilization. The sea at our feet, its murmurs and its roaring were ever in our ears, and these things led the mind to brood over strange thoughts, and lifting it with everyday life caused it to be familiar with the unreal. A sort of spell surrounded us, and each day as the voyagers did not return, we grew restless and disquieted, and yet, strange to say, we were not fearful of the most apparent danger. The spell snapped. It was all over. An interval of agonizing doubt, of days passed in miserable journeys to gain tidings of hope that took firmer root, even as they were more baseless, was changed in the certainty of the death that ellipsed all happiness for the survivors forevermore. There was something in our fate peculiar, harrowing. The remains of those we lost were cast on shore, but by the quarantine laws of the coast, we were not permitted to have possession of them. The law with respect to everything cast on land by the sea being that such should be burned to prevent the possibility of any remnant bringings of plague into Italy, and no representation could alter the law. At length, through the kind of unwearied exertions from Mr. Dawkins, our charge d'affaires at Florence, we gained permission to receive the ashes after the bodies were consumed. Nothing could equal the zeal of Trelawney in carrying our wishes into effect. He was indefatigable in his exertions and full of forethought and sagacity in his arrangements. It was a fierce task. He stood before us at last, his hands scorched and blistered by the flames of the funeral pyre, and by touching the burnt relics as he placed them in the receptacles prepared for the purpose. And there, encompassed with that small case, was gathered all that remained on earth of him whose genius and virtue were a crown of glory to the world, whose love had been the source of happiness, peace, and good, to be buried with him. The concluding stanza of the Adonis pointed out where the remains ought to be deposited, in addition to which our beloved child lay buried in the cemetery at Rome. Thither Shelley's ashes were conveyed, and the rest beneath one of the antique weed-grown towers that recur at intervals in the circuit of the massy ancient wall of Rome. We selected the hallowed place himself. There is the sepulchre, oh, not of him, but of our joy, and gray walls molder round on which dull time feeds like slow fire upon a hoary brand, and one keen pyramid with wedge sublime. Pavilion, the dust of him who planned this refuge of his memory does stand, like flame transformed to marble, and beneath a field is spread on which a newer band have pitched in heaven's smile their camp of death. Welcome him we lose with scarce extinguished breath. Could sorrow for the lost and shudder in anguish of the vacancy left behind be soothed by poetic imaginations, there were something in Shelley's fate to mitigate pangs which yet, alas, could not be so mitigated, for hard reality brings too miserably home to the mourner all that is lost of happiness, all of lonely, unsolicited struggle that remains. Still, these dreams and hues of poetry cannot blunt grief. It invests his fate with a sublime fitness, which those less nearly aligned may regard with complacency. At year before, he had poured into verse all such ideas about death as give it a glory of its own. He had, and it now seems, almost anticipated his own destiny. And when the mind figures his skiff wrapped from sight by the thunderstorm, as it was last seen upon the purple sea, and then as the cloud of the tempest passed away, no sign remained of it where it had been. Captain Roberts watched the vessel with his glass from the top of the lighthouse of Leghorn on its homeward track. They were off via Reggio at some distant shore when a storm was driven over the sea. It enveloped them and several larger vessels in darkness. When the cloud passed outwards, Roberts looked again and saw every other vessel sailing on the ocean except the little schooner, which had vanished. From that time, he could scarcely doubt the fatal truth, yet we fancied that he might have been driven towards Elba or Corsica, and so be saved. The observation made as to the spot where the boat disappeared caused it to be found through the excursions of Trelawney. For that effect, it had gone down in 10-fathom water. It had not capsized, and except such things as had floated from her, everything was found on board exactly as it had been placed when they sailed. The boat itself was uninjured. Roberts possessed himself of her and decked her, but she proved not seaworthy, and her shattered planks now lie rotting on the shore of one of the Ionian islands in which she was wrecked. Who but will regard as a prophecy the last stanza of the Adonis? The breath whose might I have invoked in song descends on me. My spirit's bark is driven far from the shore, far from the trembling throng, whose sails were never to be tempest given. The massy earth and sphered skies are riven. I am borne darkly, fearfully afar, whilst burning through the utmost veil of heaven. The soul of Adonis, like a star, becomes from the abode where the eternal are. That is so beautiful. I think I will read it again. The breath whose might I have invoked in song descends on me. My spirit's bark is driven far from the shore, far from the trembling throng, whose sails were never to be tempest given. The massy earth and spirit skies are riven. I am borne darkly, fearfully afar, whilst burning through the utmost veil of heaven. The soul of Adonis, like a star, beacons from the abode where the eternal are. And thus ends the lesson of Percy Bysshe Shelley and his wonderful life. Mary Shelley, who wrote Frankenstein. These people wrote and created all the women out there, your civil rights and equal rights. Shelley drowned for your civil rights, and Mary wrote about it. So God bless all the women and children in the world. There's no peace here today. We pray for peace again. Have a nice day.